One dinner party, one pen stroke across a map, and an entire region was placed on a course that still shapes headlines today. In 1916, while the First World War raged and the Ottoman Empire was collapsing, a British diplomat and a French negotiator met in secret. To Arab leaders, they promised freedom and independence. To each other, they promised land and power. Those promises collided. With those conflicting bargains, the fate of the Middle East was rewritten not by battles, but by deception. When the deal was exposed, it shattered trust between Europe and the Arab world and planted seeds of anger that have never fully gone away. Yet here is the part most people miss. The border most often blamed on that secret map was not actually created by it. That hidden twist is the story we are unraveling today on Armchair Archaeology. If you're into slow-burn mysteries and careful map reading, take a second to subscribe. It helps this little corner of history keep asking better questions. To understand how the lie that created the Middle East took root, we need to look at the Ottoman Empire on the eve of the First World War. For centuries, it had ruled a vast patchwork of peoples: Turks, Arabs, Kurds, Armenians, Greeks, and more. It was a world bound together not by one ethnicity, but by imperial authority. By the early 20th century, however, nationalist movements were spreading fast, and European powers were convinced the empire's days were numbered. Politicians in London and Paris mockingly called it the sick man of Europe, a phrase that revealed not just contempt, but a hunger to inherit its lands. Yet the Ottoman state was far from dead. In 1914, when it entered the Great War on the side of Germany, it mobilized more than 2.8 million soldiers. Ottoman troops defended the Dardanelles at Gallipoli, where they halted British and French forces in one of the Allies' most humiliating defeats. They held ground in Mesopotamia, forcing Britain into a costly retreat at Kut. They battled across the Sinai, in Palestine, and against Russian armies in the Caucasus. This resilience mattered. From the trenches, it did not look like a sick man at all. Britain and France were already eyeing the empire's lands, but on the battlefield, the Ottomans made every advance costly. The contradiction was striking. An empire dismissed as a dying relic still had the strength to bloody two global powers. That tension set the stage for what followed. Even while Ottoman troops fought with tenacity, diplomats in Europe were already sketching the region's future. The empire's fate was not decided only by victories or defeats at the front, but also by conversations held in backrooms thousands of miles away. And the echoes of those conversations still linger, because the borders they produced remain some of the most contested in the world today. While Ottoman armies were still fighting on multiple fronts, Britain began searching for allies inside the empire. The figure they turned to was Sharif Hussein of Mecca, a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad and guardian of Islam's holiest sites. For Britain, Hussein seemed like the man who could rally Arab tribes against the Ottomans and open a new front in the war. For Hussein, Britain represented a rare chance to secure recognition for an independent Arab kingdom stretching from the Levant to the Arabian Peninsula. In 1915, a cautious correspondence began between Hussein and Sir Henry McMahon, Britain's High Commissioner in Egypt. Over 10 letters, the two men sketched an understanding. Hussein would launch a revolt if Britain guaranteed Arab independence. McMahon's replies seemed supportive. He wrote that Britain recognizes and supports the independence of the Arabs, with only a few vaguely defined areas excluded. To Hussein, this sounded like a commitment strong enough to risk rebellion. The wording, however, was slippery. Entire provinces, like Palestine, were mentioned only obliquely. The northern borders near Syria were described with deliberate vagueness. It was like signing two leases on the same apartment. Both tenants think they own it. London's politicians were careful not to commit too much, leaving loopholes they could exploit later. McMahon's letters promised independence. At the same time, Britain negotiated with France to divide the same territories between themselves. Hussein did not know this.
Believing Britain's assurances, he raised the banner of revolt in June 1916. His sons commanded fighters along the Red Sea, striking Ottoman garrisons and sabotaging the Hijaz Railway. T.E. Lawrence, the British officer later immortalized as Lawrence of Arabia, played a supporting role, but the heart of the revolt was Hussein's faith in Britain's word. That faith was a gamble, and the cost of that gamble would shape the future of the Arab world. We're about to spend a lot of time with maps and margins. If you like to puzzle through the past with a warm drink, our Ancient Secrets mug, Armchair Archaeology Edition, was designed for these exact moments. It's a quiet nod to those hidden lines that change everything. Peek at it in our store. Link is in the pinned comment.
While Hussein's revolt was beginning in the desert, another negotiation was unfolding in Europe. In 1916, Britain and France met behind closed doors to plan how they would divide Ottoman territory once the war was won. Representing Britain was Sir Mark Sykes, a rising politician with ambition but little first-hand knowledge of the Middle East. Across from him sat François-Georges Picot, a career diplomat determined to secure French control of Syria and Lebanon. Their backgrounds were different, but together they drafted one of the most controversial agreements of the 20th century. The deal split the Arab provinces into zones of control. Britain would take southern Mesopotamia, with its oil reserves and access to the Persian Gulf, vital to protect the route to India. France would take Syria and Lebanon, home to fertile farmland and coastal cities it claimed historic ties to. Palestine was marked for international administration, an ambiguous label that pleased neither side but postponed the problem. The polite language of spheres of influence masked the reality. It was not guidance or operation. It was partition by outsiders who had no authority to give away what was not theirs. The way they drew the map revealed how little they understood the lives inside it. With charts spread across the table, Sykes and Picot used a ruler to sketch straight lines over deserts, rivers, and mountains. One boundary ran from Acre on the Mediterranean to Kirkuk in Mesopotamia, cutting through regions that had been connected for centuries by trade and kinship. What looked tidy in Paris and London was a fracture line waiting to happen. At the very moment Britain was assuring Sharif Hussein of Arab independence, it was secretly tying itself to France. In private, entire societies were reduced to bargaining chips. In public, promises of liberation continued. That duplicity left wounds that would shape the Middle East for generations. For months, the Sykes-Picot Agreement remained a carefully guarded secret, locked in the archives of London and Paris. Sharif Hussein and the Arab fighters who had risen against the Ottomans believed Britain's promises of independence were still intact. They had no idea that the borders of their hoped-for nation had already been traded away in secret. That secrecy collapsed in late 1917 when the Russian Empire fell. The Bolsheviks, who seized power in Petrograd, opened the Tsar's diplomatic files and found copies of the Allies' secret treaties. Determined to expose the hypocrisy of imperial powers and to encourage revolution abroad, they published the agreements in full. Among them was the Sykes-Picot Map, which showed Britain and France casually dividing Arab lands like spoils of war. Within weeks, the details appeared in European newspapers, and soon the revelations spread to Cairo, Damascus, and Baghdad. Then, boom, the map was out. The reaction was immediate and bitter. Arab leaders who had trusted Britain now saw written proof that independence had never been on the table. For ordinary fighters, news of the leak spread by rumor and by leaflets, and it felt like a betrayal carved in ink. The revolt that had begun in hope now carried the weight of disillusionment. In London, officials scrambled to explain. Some claimed the document had been misunderstood, others that it was only a preliminary draft. The map, however, left little room for denial. In Paris, leaders defended the deal openly, insisting that France's rights in Syria and Lebanon were legitimate and non-negotiable. The exposure changed everything. From that moment forward, Arab trust in the West was damaged beyond repair. The war continued,
but suspicion shadowed every alliance. Like modern document leaks that change public faith in governments, the revelation of Sykes-Picot reshaped perceptions overnight and became a turning point in Middle Eastern memory.
When the First World War ended in 1918, the Ottoman Empire finally collapsed. Its Arab provinces no longer belonged to Istanbul, but they were not free either. Instead, they were placed under what the League of Nations called the mandate system. In theory, this was meant to guide local peoples towards self-government. In reality, it gave Britain and France new legal cover to take control of the lands they had already divided in secret. Britain received mandates over Iraq, Transjordan, and Palestine. France took Syria and Lebanon. Though these were not called colonies, the two powers ruled them in much the same way. Administrators were appointed, European officials dominated key offices, and foreign armies enforced order. To many Arabs, the language of mentorship and preparation sounded hollow. What they saw on the ground looked and felt like occupation. The League's rhetoric captured the contradiction. Its charter described mandates as a sacred trust of civilization, suggesting benevolence and moral duty. But the reality was that Britain controlled oil fields, trade routes, and ports, while France oversaw tax collection, school curricula, and local armies. Far from preparing independence, the system deepened dependence. The new borders also created fragile states. Iraq was stitched together from 3 Ottoman provinces with little shared history, binding Sunnis, Shias, and Kurds in one political unit. Lebanon was cut from Syria to give Christians a majority, even though many Muslims resented the arrangement. These decisions were not accidents. They reflected the priorities of London and Paris, not the aspirations of local peoples. For many in the Arab world, the mandates confirmed what the leaked Sykes-Picot Map had already suggested. The war had not brought liberation. It had only replaced Ottoman authority with a European version of empire dressed in new language. If moments like this leak make you sit back and whisper, "No way," you can fuel future deep dives with a super thanks. It keeps the research going and helps us unpack the next hidden archive. Once Britain and France secured their mandates, they faced the task of turning territories into states. The decisions were rarely made in the region itself. They were made in offices in London, Paris, and Geneva, where maps were spread across tables and boundaries were sketched with pencils and rulers. These borders looked neat to the men drawing them, but they cut across landscapes, communities, and histories that did not fit into straight lines. Iraq is a clear example. Before the war, it existed as 3 separate Ottoman provinces: Basra in the south, Baghdad in the center, and Mosul in the north. Each had its own elites, its own networks of trade, and its own mix of faiths. Britain decided to combine them into a single state under a Hashemite monarch. This created a patchwork of Shia Arabs, Sunni Arabs, and Kurds, groups with competing interests now expected to live under one political framework. The divisions baked into Iraq's foundation would haunt it for the rest of the century. France applied the same logic in Syria. To secure its position, it divided the territory into multiple units: Damascus, Aleppo, the Alawite state, the Druze state, and Lebanon. The creation of Lebanon gave Christians a majority, but it also ensured that Muslims felt excluded. Rather than building unity, these boundaries encouraged communities to compete for influence and protection. Officials sometimes spoke about these frontiers as if they were drawing property lines on an estate map, not shaping the lives of millions. The straight edges ignored trade routes, kinship networks, and seasonal migrations that had tied the region together for centuries. The result was a set of states with fragile foundations. The tidy lines that pleased diplomats in Europe created fault lines that still crack open in conflicts today. The mandate system was presented as a path to independence, but people across the Arab world quickly saw it for what it was: empire under a new name. Disappointment turned to defiance, and in the 1920s, uprisings erupted against both Britain and France. These were not minor disturbances. They were broad movements that revealed how deeply the sense of betrayal had sunk. In Iraq, the frustration boiled over almost immediately. In 1920, tribal leaders, clerics, and former Ottoman officers united in revolt against British rule. Tens of thousands joined in, and the rebellion spread rapidly from the countryside to the edges of Baghdad.
Britain was caught unprepared and had to deploy massive reinforcements to regain control. For the first time in the region, airplanes were used systematically to bomb villages, a shocking spectacle of modern technology turned on civilians. The death toll was enormous, and the memory of foreign aircraft overhead became a lasting symbol of domination. In Syria, resistance culminated in the Great Revolt of 1925. Druze fighters ignited the uprising, soon joined by Sunnis from Damascus and peasants from rural areas. The French response was devastating. They bombarded Damascus, reducing entire neighborhoods of the ancient city to rubble. Survivors carried the memory of smoke and ruins as proof that French promises of guidance masked naked coercion. Even in Palestine, where the mandate was still new, early protests erupted against British policies. Communities recognized that the future being built for them was not independence, but another form of control. These uprisings were ultimately crushed, yet their significance endured. They showed that the peoples of the Middle East would not accept foreign-drawn borders without a fight. Each revolt left behind martyrs, memories, and a deepened mistrust of European powers that would shape politics for generations.
The new borders and mandates did more than replace one empire with another. They hardened old rivalries and created new ones, shaping politics for the next century. In Iraq, 3 Ottoman provinces with little shared history were stitched into a single state. Sunnis, who were a minority, filled many of the most powerful positions in the army and government. Shia, who made up the majority, were sidelined. Kurds in the north, with their own language and culture, were incorporated into a state that gave them little recognition. These imbalances simmered beneath the surface, waiting for crises to erupt. In Syria and Lebanon, French administrators carved the region into smaller units to secure control. Lebanon was created to ensure a Christian majority, while Syria was divided into Alawite, Druze, and Sunni majority areas. On paper, this looked like careful management. In practice, it encouraged communities to see themselves as rivals, competing for French favor. The role of minorities became especially significant. The French relied heavily on Alawites and Druze for recruitment into their colonial army, giving them opportunities denied to others. Christians in Lebanon were granted political privileges that outlasted the mandate itself. These choices deepened sectarian divides and left communities mistrustful of each other. The consequences were long-lasting. The Alawite foothold in the Syrian military eventually helped bring the Assad family to power. Lebanon's delicate sectarian balance produced decades of instability, including a civil war that lasted from 1975 to 1990. In Iraq, the exclusion of Shia and Kurds became a recurring fault line, visible again in the chaos that followed the 2003 U.S. invasion. The mandates were sold as preparation for self-rule. In reality, they were blueprints for division. The structures built in the 1920s still shape the conflicts and mistrust we see in the region today. Where do you think the turning point really was? The ruler on the map, the leak in 1917, or the way mandates were enforced afterward? Drop your theory below. Reading your angles is my favorite part of making these.
The borders drawn after the First World War were never just lines on paper. They became the framework within which nearly every major conflict of the modern Middle East has unfolded. Iraq's instability, Syria's civil war, Lebanon's political paralysis, and the ongoing crisis in Palestine all bear the imprint of decisions made in London and Paris a century ago. In Iraq, divisions built into the state's foundations repeatedly resurfaced. The Sunni-led government of Saddam Hussein marginalized Shia Arabs and Kurds, fueling uprisings that scarred the country. When the United States invaded in 2003, the same fractures reappeared. Sectarian militias and separatist movements filled the vacuum, echoing divisions first created when 3 Ottoman provinces were forced into one country. In Syria, the legacy of French rule also endured. By favoring minorities like the Alawites in the military, France tilted the balance of power. Decades later, that imbalance helped the Assad dynasty rise to dominance. When protests erupted in 2011, the fault lines deepened into a civil war that still bears the marks of sectarian mistrust and rival claims to legitimacy. Lebanon's political system is another inheritance of the Mandate period. Its government is still organized around a fragile balance between Christian, Sunni, and Shia communities, an arrangement that has led to repeated deadlocks. The 15-year civil war from 1975 to 1990 was one eruption of that instability, and the country's repeated crises since then show how fragile the system remains. Palestine, meanwhile, became the arena where Britain's contradictory promises collided most violently. The consequences of those promises continue to dominate global headlines. The Sykes-Picot Agreement did not alone create these problems, but it remains the symbol of foreign powers imposing borders that ignored local realities. Its legacy lives on, not in dusty archives, but in the conflicts that still dominate the news today.
Sykes-Picot has become a byword for betrayal. When people talk about artificial borders in the Middle East, they often point to that 1916 agreement as the moment the map was created. In popular imagination, nearly every frontier in the region can be traced to a ruler held by Sykes and Picot. The truth is more complicated. The agreement itself was not a finished blueprint for modern states. It was a wartime bargain, designed to reassure Britain and France that they would both benefit from the Ottoman collapse. The famous line from Acre to Kirkuk, often reproduced in textbooks, was never enforced as an actual frontier. After the war, the map was revised again and again as diplomats, generals, and administrators adapted to uprisings and shifting priorities. In the early 1920s, Britain combined Basra, Baghdad, and Mosul into the new state of Iraq and created Transjordan under a Hashemite prince. France reorganized Syria multiple times, first splitting it into smaller states, then reuniting them when division proved unworkable. Palestine's boundaries were influenced less by Sykes and Picot than by the Balfour Declaration of 1917 and the waves of conflict that followed. If the actual lines change so often, why does the myth of Sykes-Picot endure? Partly because it captures the arrogance of the moment. Two European officials sat at a table, dividing lands they barely knew, with no regard for the people who lived there. Later generations, from Arab nationalists in the 1950s to militant groups in the 21st century, invoked the agreement as a symbol of foreign domination. The borders of the modern Middle East were not created in one night in 1916. They emerged from years of improvisation, bargains, and betrayals. But the power of the Sykes-Picot story lies in what it represents, the sense that the region was treated as a chessboard by outsiders. We began with the image of two diplomats sketching lines across a map in 1916. The Sykes-Picot Agreement became infamous as the lie that created the Middle East. But here is the twist. The border most often blamed on that secret deal was not part of it at all. The jagged lines separating Jordan from Iraq, sometimes nicknamed Winston's Hiccup, was drawn years later, in the early 1920s. At a conference in Cairo, Winston Churchill chaired discussions on how to manage Britain's mandates. A widely repeated story says that when he sketched the frontier on a map, his hand slipped, leaving a kink that later became official. What people assume was created by Sykes and Picot was in fact Churchill's quick improvisation. This detail matters because it reveals a larger truth. The Middle East was not created in one night by two diplomats. It was reshaped again and again by negotiations, betrayals, and hurried adjustments. Sykes-Picot was the opening chapter, but the borders we know today were the result of decades of improvisation. Each layer left behind tensions that continue to shape the region's politics and conflicts. So, was the Middle East made by Europeans, or was it already reshaping itself from within? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Do you think today's struggles were born in 1916, or are we oversimplifying a much deeper history? If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel,
and ring the bell so you never miss the next investigation into the past. Until next time, keep questioning, stay curious, and remember, borders that feel eternal began as a quick pencil line on someone else's map.